So to start, one of the unique things with Matt is how he sets up. So you can see that his feet are pointing in a certain direction, and I've often seen Matt aim to the right with his lower body with his feet, but you can see the hips and shoulders are actually open at address. So that goes to dispelling the myth that you need everything in perfect alignment. Now, I don't like to see positions way off or alignments of different body segments way off at the start, but again, I like to see swings like this because it challenges my own beliefs on this topic. We can also note here, this is a face-on of Matt, and you can see the grip is actually quite weak. And how I look at that or visualize that is drawing a line down the club shaft. I look at the wrist joint. So if I put a red dot on his glove there, normally, for most pros, that is the other side of that line, the right side or the left side as we view it. So that's what I call a weaker grip position, and in fact is on the same line as his posture, or a very similar line to his posture, which if we were to compare to a more orthodox looking swing of Justin Thomas here, you can see that it's almost 90 degrees difference between the club shaft positions. Body positions are quite similar. Maybe the right arm is in a much different position, which we'll have a look at in a moment. And they kind of relate. The shaft angle and the right arm position do relate there. I would like to note that just to compare the difference here, there are great players who have done the opposite. So this is Ray Floyd, and you can see, I mean, look how inside that club shaft is there, or the club head, compared to Matt Wolff at this position. They're pretty much opposite ends of the spectrum there, and that would change how the shaft looks a little later on in the swing. You can also see this left foot, the lead foot there. If I do it in yellow so it's a little clearer, the lead foot has been picked up off the ground, and I think that many golfers will instinctively do this when they first start, and then they get taught to keep the foot on the ground. And there are certain situations where I can see keeping the foot on the ground as being valuable. I do it myself, but that's only because I was taught that. And I think it's been something that's been perpetuated in the golf industry for a long time. And I think Brandel Chambly wrote a good book on this topic, or this was one of the elements that he discussed about how if you go back to, say, the 50s, 40s, 60s even, most golfers actually pick the foot up off the ground. So it's not a bad move. Lots of golfers see it as, oh, that's different right now, but that's only because they're looking at all the modern players who've been taught to keep that foot on the ground. There are actually certain advantages to taking that foot up off the ground, and for older golfers, it can help you with increasing hip turn. It can also increase ground pressure when we go to transition later, which can improve power. If I take Matt on a few more frames, but if we compare this position from Matt with the club face, so that's Matt Wolff's club face at the top there. Look at Dustin Johnson on the left. It's hard to see it with that background, but I think it's gone beyond horizontal there. So it's a very, very different look, more than 90 degrees different at the top there. And you can see part of that is going to be down to the wrist positions at the top. Matt has more cup or more flexion to that lead wrist, and Dustin Johnson has a little bit more bow or extension to that lead wrist. But also a lot of that has to do with the grip or the starting positions with the hands. So again, here's two opposite ends of the spectrum to see that there are many functional variants of swing on tour. And although Matt's swing is quite different to Dustin Johnson's, there are several players throughout history who have swung in a very similar fashion to. Now the beauty of Matt's swing is in the transition. So there are a few things of note here. Number one, if I draw a line on the top of Matt's head here, what you see is in transition, you see quite a notable squat. So he's dropped in height. That's more than a golf ball in height. That's quite a few inches, 7, maybe 8 inches or so in height. And many players have this. Tiger exhibits it. In fact, I would say over 90% of the tour exhibit that squatting action in transition. If you watch the right arm of Matt, it goes from what we call internal rotation to external rotation. That right elbow gets pulled down in this direction here. And so that is a great shallowing move for the club. And you can see how the shaft there goes from that steep across the line to a much shallower laid off look. And by this position in the swing, Matt looks like most other guys on tour. Now that's a very similar move to how baseball players work, or the action of a baseball swing. So you can see that baseball bat is very steep at that position, and look at the right arm. Look how high the elbow is. And then as the player starts to force, as the baseball starts to force the bat, you see how that elbow drops down closer to the body and starts driving forward. So that rear elbow is actually leading the shoulder at this point, and that shallows that bat. So the bat gets from a very steep position to shallow. And that's now again, from this position here, Matt looks like almost every other guy on tour. Perhaps that shaft is a little flatter than most. You might see a little bit higher than the lead or the trail forearm there by most players, but it's a pretty good position, or well, it's an excellent position, especially with a driver when you want to be swinging a little bit shallower and perhaps hitting up on the ball. And again, in terms of matchups, this flexion of the lead wrist there, that actually squares the club face up earlier, and is a great match for his weak grip, because most players with a weak grip would hit it way off to the right, hit blocks and slices. But for Matt, if he bows that lead wrist like that, and that's created by the transition, or the forces in transition, then that bowed lead wrist plus the weak grip, they kind of neutralize each other. And it's a good matchup because it not only creates the face squaring, but actually adds some shaft lean and adds the ability to create more power through impact, because he can now unleash those angles, those wrist angles, to add a little bit more speed at the bottom. And normally from this position here, that club for most golfers would swing way out to the right. It would be a really in to out swing path. But what Matt does well, and I know him and his instructor Gigi work on this, he rotates the body open, his chest especially, so that chest works open, and you can actually see how much to the left the hands work. So if I draw a wall here representing where the back of Matt Wolf's lead hand is, by the time he gets to impact, look how much farther left those hands have worked. They've been pulled off that wall. And again, that's a great matchup. A very shallow club shaft with a hand from face on. We've talked about how Matt squatted into this position, and that leg separation that you see here, so the knees are quite far apart. That's not something I like to teach. I don't like to tell players to get their legs apart like that, but it usually is a result from that pressing into the weighing scale effect. So by pressing into the ground in transition, the legs will usually do that clearing action or the separating action. And again, that's another example of where I'd like to focus more on the kinetics or the forces involved rather than the movement. From this squatted position, Matt's in a very powerful position. He can actually use the ground now, and this is the next part of his move where he actually springs up. It's pretty much a jump. I mean, you can actually see that lead foot there comes off the ground and twists. And that's actually quite a safe move for the leg. A lot of players say, oh, isn't the snapping of the left leg going to cause damage to the knee? Well, no, because during that twisting motion and the straightening of the knee, the lead foot is actually off the ground, so there's no torque going on in the knee. If he did that with his foot on the ground, and this is again where a lot of previous golf instruction I think has gone wrong by trying to force that lead foot on the ground, and there are certain times where that might be valuable, but if you were to do that with Matt, he probably would break his legs. So it's great that he's instinctively found to let that foot float is fine for him.